It's going to be a hot one as we go through this. Oh, hold on a minute. Somebody's telling me I'm being recorded. So I've got it. I've told it I've got it. Right then, let's whistle stop through this because we've got a lot to get through. There's probably going to be some questions. Feel free to come off mute and ask some questions, as Olivia has said, or you can put them in the chat. And if they are in the chat, then we'll deal with them at the end. So let's run through home working. The term home worker is not defined in the Employment Rights Act. So it's a term that we will use a bit like the term bullying, which also is not defined in the Employment Rights Act or in any of the discrimination legislation. But it's a term that we use to describe those people that may entirely work from home or divide their time between the workplace and home. I think up until the pandemic, there was obviously a lot of statistics to show that most people actually worked on the company's premises rather than at home. And we've seen a massive shift in that, haven't we, with people either working entirely from home or hybrid working, as it's becoming known as, whilst the pandemic has been ongoing. Now, why it's timely now to talk about home working again is because, of course, we are now hopefully, she says hopefully, heading towards restrictions being lifted on the 21st of June. I think I saw in the news today, I don't know if everybody else saw it, the indication that that is looking likely that it may be delayed possibly by 2 weeks up to a month. But certainly we're still looking as if we're on target for restrictions being lifted entirely, which means things like the social distancing measures and all of that sort of stuff will be removed. That in itself then brings into question, doesn't it, temporary arrangements that you might have had for people to do some home working during the pandemic, or in the alternative, you formalising what you want to do in terms of home working arrangements. So we know, don't we, because of how it's worked during the pandemic, that there's a lot of home working benefits to the organisation. It's been considered a bit of a perk, I think, probably in the past, but it's very much now at the forefront of what employees are and will be looking for if they are going to be working with you or continuing to work with you. So what are some of those benefits? We've got reduced overhead costs. Obviously, we've got expensive office space and other overheads. And obviously those will be either substantially reduced, or you might look to relocate for cheaper and smaller premises. So there could be good cost savings for the organisation. Increased productivity. I think we've certainly seen, MFG have seen as an organisation that because people aren't travelling, sometimes from long distances to come and commute, or they're able to use their time better throughout the day, there's actually been a substantial increase in productivity where it probably wasn't expected or indeed needed. You know, we're not saying here people weren't performing, but actually there's been an increase in that productivity. Better motivation. People can juggle obviously their family life and their work requirements more easily, and that motivates people better. Skills retention. With those sorts of responsibilities at home, people are looking for that type of flexible working, and we've seen a move, haven't we, with the change in the flexible working regulations and what's applicable to people from day one rights in terms of making applications for flexible working. Team flexibility. Again, it means it's been easier electronically to get people together rather than having to get people travelling all across the country to attend meetings. And organisations have been geared better towards home working. We've seen obviously a substantial increase in technology, which has enabled us to react better to home working during the pandemic. But also you've had the benefit, haven't you, of people not getting stuck in traffic, not getting caught out with weather issues, and being able to actually just get up in the morning, do what they need to do, get online and start their work. And again, that's been seen as a massive benefit. But there are, of course, drawbacks as well. There's the potential loss of control over those that are working from home and a potential damage to team working and culture. You may have to have different management styles to oversee home workers. And you may not be able to support home workers in the same way that you would have done if they were actually attending at the workplace. You can become overly dependent on technology, which again can be a negative for the organisation. You've got to have that degree of trust, or a large degree of trust, with people working from home and assuming that they are pulling their weight, rather than people that perhaps, you know, are spending their whole day revolving it around personal issues rather than actually putting work first. You've got the issue of potential data security breaches, and I'll have a look at GDPR and all of that sort of stuff a little later on in the presentation. And requests are often made for home working by those employees who think it's easier for them to manage their personal commitments rather than, you know, it being, I'm going to put the workplace first. So there's also that concern around getting the right balance. I think we've also seen, haven't we, and this is a really vital and important one, the detrimental effect on people working in an isolated way. Mental health, stress, isolation, all of that goes together. So there are some drawbacks in how you support people, how you can get the right balance for people so that it doesn't affect their mental health working on their own. Having looked at the pros and cons, obviously there are a lot of legal implications, practicalities that you need to think about for those that are going to be home working. Some of the provisions of the employment contract should be tailored to fit the specific needs of home working, and some of the issues around the contracts, if you haven't looked at your contracts already, with the move and the potential opening up of people doing hybrid working and this becoming more permanent as a way of working rather than a temporary arrangement, you need to start looking at the contracts. So place of work is one of them. Normally the contract will say that the employee is required to work at the company's premises. But obviously, if you're going to have an arrangement where you perhaps allow employees to work 3 days in the office and 2 days at home, and that's going to be a permanent entitlement, then the contract needs to be looked at from that point of view. Remember, of course, always reserve the right to require employees to attend on those days that you've said home working may be allowed. For example, if the business need was required, or you needed training or some other requirement. So you need to still reserve that right. Hours of work, it's really crucial, isn't it, to ensure that you've set out the boundaries of what's going to happen in terms of hours of work, and that's provided for in the contract as well. So is it the case that if people are working from home, you are expecting them to be online for office hours between 9 and 5? If that's the case, you need to make that clear in the contract that that not only applies when they're working at the company's premises, but also when they're working at home. Or are you going to have more flexibility on the days that they're working from home, in which case the contract should record that? What's the reason for doing that? Well, if it comes to the situation where the employee is not doing what they should be doing and you've formalised it in the contract, you're in a better position to enforce what has been agreed in terms of the terms of them working from home. Rest breaks is another issue. You need to make sure that the employee is complying with the working time regulations and taking appropriate rest breaks. So again, the contract needs to reinforce that for any home working. It could be that any amendments to the contract are set aside a home working policy, and you might want to set out some of these provisions in the policy also. Salary and benefits, you need to make sure that the salary and benefits package is the same as those working in the organisation and actually coming to work each day. They need to be treated the same to avoid any claims in relation to discrimination. When considering benefits, think about how detrimental it might be for some employees if they're not at work or home and they're doing some home working, and whether you need to compensate in that respect. And it could be that you take the view, well, if you are home working, you can't have some of these subsidised benefits. It could be a subsidised canteen, any of those things. You know, if you're home working, you don't get that benefit. But again, that needs to be made clear in the terms that will apply for any home working. Expenses, you'll need to specify what's going to be the position with respect to travelling to the office, things like telephone, heating and lighting costs. And we'll look at the heating and lighting costs, the things about being at home, a little bit later on again, together with insurance premiums. The European Social Partners issued a voluntary framework agreement on telework in 2002, which suggested if homework is performed on a regular basis, the employer should cover all the direct costs, particularly those related to communications. However, this agreement is not binding in the UK, which is why we've seen nothing from the government that says that this is what an entitlement is to staff in relation to those sorts of expenses being paid. What you do need to think about, though, is if you are requiring people to come in on days where it's confirmed they are home working, what's going to be the arrangement in relation to travel expenses? Holidays, they should have the same amount of holiday comparable to those that are working in the office. So there shouldn't be any issue in that respect. But what you might need to just deal with is the issue of processes about asking for holiday and making sure that people are clear that if you are working from home, you still need to comply with the normal policies. Illness, that should be the same. And again, it's about ensuring the contract's clear about what the mechanism is for reporting absence if people can't actually come to work, or work if they're home working on a particular day. Confidentiality you need to think about. Obviously, all employees have an implied duty not to disclose confidential information or use it for any other purpose. In practice, it's more difficult for you to police, isn't it, the use of confidential information when somebody's working from home. So whilst the implied duty of confidentiality applies equally to home workers, you'll want to ensure that your contract includes an express clause about the use or misuse of information and defining what confidential information is. That defining of what confidential information is probably the most important element, because what you want to ensure is that anybody that's working from home understands that if you have this set of papers and these types of documents when you're working from home, the company considers that to be confidential information, and it will flow from that, therefore, what they need to be doing to protect that confidential information. You'll need to think about how the employee is going to keep that information secure. And in particular, you know, who's going to have access to that type of information? How are you going to protect the information? What passwords are there going to be? What encryption is there going to be? Is there going to be a secure filing cabinet? If so, is there going to be a secure shredder or confidential bin? How is somebody going to disclose this information or dispose of the information if it is deemed to be confidential without it being a breach of GDPR, or you effectively having, you know, rafts of your confidential information simply being put in the bin? So all of those things need to really be thought about. Part of the way that you have control over confidential information can be about equipment and the use of monitoring and communication systems. So you need to consider what equipment will be required by a home worker, who will provide and pay for it, and who can have access to it. If the home worker is to be using computer equipment that's supplied by you and will have access to the internet or email facilities, you'll need to consider the application of systems you have in place for policing the use which home workers have at their disposal. You'll also need to satisfy yourself that the risk of a data security breach is low, possibly by carrying out a data privacy impact assessment. You can address the following issues by the introduction of an IT and internet and telecommunications policy. So things like measures to protect confidentiality of electronic information, the use of email and internet, the extent to which, if at all, either may be used for personal reasons, the employer's monitoring of the use of electronic communications, what's considered inappropriate use, clear information about the types of monitoring that you may undertake, who will have access to information and access to the computer. You need to make sure that any policy that you've got captures how a home worker may well be using that information whilst they're at home and accessing your systems. So, for example, does it address and provide guidance to employees on use of social media? So the employee's obligations to protect your reputation are high and will continue even if somebody is working from home. There's a real tension, isn't there, between being a brand ambassador for your employer and any disparaging of the brand through social media in their own time. If people are working from home, there's a little bit of a blurring, isn't there, between what's work and what's personal. So it's really important that the use of social media and the protection of the company through social media is reinforced through appropriate amendments to your social media policies or updating your IT and communications policies. Discipline and grievances, they will apply as normal, and procedures will need to be adapted if persons, for example, working from home entirely in terms of remote hearings and still dealing with employees and complying with the ACAS Code of Practice and your company policies if you have got somebody that's home working. Importantly, set out in your disciplinary procedure, you will have examples of misconduct and potentially gross misconduct. If you've got people working from home, just think about those examples and how they may need to be adjusted to incorporate misconduct that may apply at work, at home. So, for example, you know, misusing systems whilst at home, you know, not undertaking work or disclosing confidential information or not disposing of confidential information correctly. Just think about those examples and any that may need to be updated. The right to enter. Now, this is an interesting one. You'll need to reserve in the contract the right to enter the employee's home, for example, to install, maintain and service equipment, or to recover property on termination, or to carry out risk assessments for health and safety. That probably doesn't sound very palatable because you don't really want to be going in and out of people's houses, but ultimately you need to reserve in the contract that right to do so if it is necessary for you to enter. Otherwise, it could be a situation where somebody's employment's been terminated, but you can't recover the property, and you have to resort to some form of solicitor's instruction to get the property back, the police, or indeed court litigation. Trial period. You will need to consider whether you wish to include a provision enabling the home working arrangement to be brought to an end or subject to some sort of trial period. So if you have concerns about how the arrangement's going to work, and some of that really probably will have been allayed by home working during the pandemic, it's sensible to have an initial trial period. Now, it could be that the employee's been working from home entirely and they now want to work from home 4 days a week, even though restrictions may be lifted. If that's the case and everybody else is coming back to work, you may want to instill some form of trial period to see whether or not it's going to work, given that others may be returning to work. The offer of a trial period can assist in the defence of any discrimination claim, and we've got the case of Southall versus London Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Sorry, Liv, this is a Chamber of Commerce one. A tribunal accepted that a trial period was reasonable. The employee had requested a change of hours following maternity leave, but refused to undergo a trial period. Her refusal helped justify the employer's rejection of the proposal from her. The employee argued the imposition of a trial period amounted to indirect sex discrimination, but the tribunal found that the trial period would have been justified in the circumstances. And why wouldn't it be? Slightly different scenario there where it applied to a maternity returner, but actually the principles are still the same. In Dillon and Rentokil, a tribunal held that the employer was not justified in refusing to allow a supervisor to work from 9:15 to 3 instead of 9 to 5 for 50% of the time and to be available by telephone when not at work. The tribunal held that a reasonable employer would have suggested a trial period for the arrangement, particularly for a long-serving and valued employee. So in practice, an employee will usually agree to a trial period without difficulty. Your obligation to make a decision on the request would in effect be suspended until the end of the trial period, when the parties should meet to give feedback on how the arrangement has been working in practice. If a request for home working is made by way of a formal flexible working request, you need to be aware, of course, that you need to follow the appropriate flexible working legislation. But there's nothing to prevent the parties, although that legislation is silent on the issue of trial period, there's nothing to prevent the parties in that type of process from agreeing a trial period, as long as both parties agree it. And what will happen at the end of the trial period. The right to revert. So there are a number of circumstances where you may wish to bring an employee's home working arrangement to an end. For example, where you've reserved the right to ask the employee to revert to normal working practices at the end of the unsatisfactory trial period, where home working has been a temporary arrangement, such as may have been during the pandemic, or where changes to the employer's business or personnel make it impossible for the employer to organise work effectively, with the need for the employee to stop working from home. Once the parties have embarked on a home working arrangement, it's difficult or going to be difficult to force the employee to revert to office working, even if there's an express term theoretically enabling you to do so. For example, a female employee asked to cease home working may be able to bring an indirect sex discrimination claim, in which case the employer would need to show objectively why the arrangement had not worked. If an employee could not bring a discrimination claim, the exercise of a contractual right requiring the employee to revert to conventional working is subject to the implied term of mutual trust and confidence. So to terminate an arrangement which has been working perfectly satisfactorily without any good reason may be deemed a breach of that implied term, thus giving the employee the right to discharge the contract, resign, and potentially claim constructive dismissal. Therefore, changes should only be implemented reasonably, lawfully, and with consultation. If it's the end of a trial period, then make sure there's appropriate consultation with the employees to reach agreement about what's going to happen going forward. Termination, the contract should include the normal provisions relating to termination, but think about, as I said to you, return of company property, return of confidential information, and things like that. Data protection. There are significant data protection implications arising from the general data protection regulations, which we all love. You need to take appropriate technical and organisation measures against unauthorised or unlawful processing of data that identifies individuals. So we know that processing is widely defined to include obtaining, storing, viewing, holding, recording, transmitting, or destroying information. Home workers may need specific training on their obligations and those of the employer in relation to data protection, confidentiality, and concerning procedures to follow and what is not and what is authorised use of the data. In particular, some of the things that have come up whilst I've been advising clients, whilst people have been working from home, there seems to have been an increase in, you know, when you sort of start an email and you type a couple of letters and somebody's email address comes up, and you think you've emailed that person, you send off a load of information to them, and actually you realise it's gone to the wrong email address. There's certainly been an increase in that sort of activity where there's been significant breaches of data. So maybe that's an issue where employees may need training. I referred earlier to a data privacy impact assessment, and that's necessary to be carried out where somebody's working from home. The ICO has the power directly to impose significant fines if data is breached. So what could the assessment cover? Who has access to the computer and personal data stored on it? Should specific security measures be put in place to ensure that members of the household can't have access to the information? The most practical route is for you to provide all of the equipment and forbid any access by other members of the household. Will the employee's home be left unattended for periods? If so, how is it secured? Does the remote working system permit the employee to encrypt or password information? And is sharing of passwords clearly forbidden? Are employees instructed to change their passwords at regular intervals? Where will paper files be kept? Are there suitable systems for storage, such as secure filing cabinets? How is the information moved between home and the workplace, both in terms of physical transfer or by electronic transfer? Are employees given guidance about what data it is appropriate to transfer? Are there rules on retention of documents, i.e. what about shredding and deletion of information? And is equipment provided for effective shredding? What measures will need to be taken against accidental loss, destruction or damage? Have staff been given training and guidance, and are regular reminders sent to staff? So those are the things you need to think about for your data privacy assessment. Quickly moving on to health and safety, you're responsible for the welfare, health and safety so far as reasonably practicable for those people working from home. And even though they're not working in the workplace, you are still obliged to be responsible for their health and safety whilst they are working from home. You will need to address the following health and safety issues in the context of home working. Firstly, there's stress. We all know how difficult it's been working from home. Some home workers may have difficulty enforcing boundaries between work and home life, and that can lead to increased stress. They may become isolated, as I've said before, and lack the support networks available. You should be aware of the issues, consider steps that you can take to monitor work and stress levels, put in place support for individuals. Equipment supplied by you must be suitable for its purpose, maintained in good working order and inspected regularly. You must ensure that suitable and sufficient lighting is provided at any place where a person uses work equipment, and this may involve simple steps to enhance the lighting, such as you would have taken if somebody had been working in the workplace. Electricity, the use of electrical equipment at work is covered by a variety of EU and UK legislation. You are responsible for the equipment you supply. However, the home worker's domestic supply, including electrical sockets, remains their responsibility. First aid, you must supply appropriate first aid provisions and supplies. But thinking about it, if people are office workers and working from home, there's probably a really low risk of any accidents, and therefore you shouldn't really have an obligation to provide comprehensive first aid kits. Accidents, obviously, if someone's working from home, they still need to report that accident if they've been home working and had an accident. There's no legal obligation on you to provide the equipment necessary for home working, but you do need to think about those employees who may have a disability and whether the provision of equipment is necessary to ensure that you've carried out your obligations for reasonable adjustments under Section 20 of the Equality Act. Most employers will want the home workers to use only your equipment to ensure compatibility with systems and proper virus protection. If home working is more than minimal, it's also sensible to provide a dedicated telephone line. Regular home workers may also need broadband, high-speed internet and shredders. You may need to want to think about how you're going to make arrangements for that with the employees. More generally, home workers should be warned against the use of unauthorised software. Steps need to be taken to ensure that those working at home receive guidance on how to install antivirus protection, software updates, and how to protect the equipment from loss, damage or destruction. If employees use their own equipment, they may seek an agreement that the employer will pay the cost of maintenance, repair, and fair wear and tear. In return, the employee should undertake to maintain the equipment properly and enter into appropriate service contracts. Insurance, any equipment provided by the employer will need to be covered by the employer's insurance policy. If this is not possible, the employer should require the employee to take out and maintain satisfactory insurance cover. And if that's an additional cost, it's likely the employer should pick that cost up. Household expenses and travel costs. This is something I get a lot of questions about. A home worker who's an employee may be entitled to claim a deduction against taxable income for certain household expenses and travel costs. For a household expense to be tax deductible, the expense must be incurred wholly, exclusively and necessarily in the performance of the duties of employment. Guidelines issued by HMRC state that Section 336 test will be met if all of the following requirements are met. The duties carried out at home are substantive duties of employment, meaning that they represent all or part of the central duties of employment. 2, those duties cannot be performed without the use of appropriate facilities. 3, no such appropriate facilities are available to the employee on the employer's premises, or the nature of the job requires the employee to live so far from the premises that it's unreasonable to expect them to travel. And at no time, either before or after the contract's drawn up, is the employee able to choose between working at the employee's premises or elsewhere. HMRC applies these rules restrictively. The fact that an employee does some work at home because there's no time to complete it during the working day, or because the employer's premises are too far away or inconvenient to reach at certain times, is not a sufficient explanation. Similarly, relief will not be available where an employee simply chooses to work from home some of the time, and the third and fourth requirement therefore will not be met. If a home worker can satisfy the test in section 336 of the IT EPA, the following deductions can be claimed: the additional cost of lighting and heating a room while being used for work, the metered cost of water used in the performance of duties, the unit cost of business telephone calls and business internet connection. However, some expenditure is considered to be incurred mainly for domestic purposes in a single indivisible sum, and therefore no part is included wholly and exclusively in the performance of duties. No relief is available for such expenditure which includes council tax or rates, rent, water rates, mortgage repayments, household insurance premiums. The fact that an employee is entitled to a deduction for the additional expenses of working at home does not automatically mean that they're entitled to a deduction for expenses of travelling from home to another workplace. The usual rules will apply to travel to a temporary workplace. The employee has to show that the location of their home is an objective requirement of the job rather than personal choice. And in Kirkwood versus Evans, there was the approach that the courts have taken to tax deductions for employees who work from home. Mr. Evans was a civil servant who lived in Kings Lynn, worked in Leeds. Following introduction of a voluntary home working scheme, he worked at home 4 days a week, travelling to Leeds on only 1 day each week. Under the scheme, he lost his office space in Leeds, but was provided with equipment to support an office at home. Both Mr. Evans and his employer could terminate the homework arrangement. The High Court rejected the argument that Mr. Evans should be entitled to a tax deduction for the household costs he incurred while working at home. The court said that he'd chosen to work from home, and the fact that the employer no longer provided him with an office was irrelevant. In most cases, therefore, employees will be unable to claim household expenses or the cost of travelling to the office. Payments by employers to reimburse employees for reasonable additional household expenses incurred while working at home under home working arrangements have been exempt since the 6th of April 2003. The exemption only applies where the employee works at home regularly by agreement with the employer instead of working on the employer's premises. It does not apply if the employee simply takes work home from time to time. The payments are intended to meet reasonable additional household expenses, and as a general guideline, an employee can have tax relief on £6 a week from 6th of April 2020 without supporting evidence of the costs. If they want to claim more, then they have to provide supporting evidence. And that's everything that I wanted to cover about home working and the legal obligations. I know it's a whistle-stop tour, so any questions, please, pop them in the chat or raise them at the end by coming off mute.
Thank you, Sally. I was literally just about to jump in there, so that was good timing. Thank you very much. Going to hand straight over to Andrea for the next 20 minutes or so, just so that we can allow a good sort of 5 minutes for questions, if that's okay. Sally, I'm just going to pop you on mute, and I will hand over to Andrea.
Thank you. Is that okay? And you can see my screen there, Olivia? Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Sally. Okay, so Sally's told us all about the legal aspects there that we're all obliged to, and I'm going to take you through some of the ways that hopefully I can help you to reach those obligations. So digitally, as Sally said, we have to provide the employees with the equipment and the tools to perform their work from home. This really covers the whole thing that we're trying to do, which I suppose in a nutshell is a digital transformation piece, which is where we have become, and a lot of that has been accelerated, and well done to all those employers that have accelerated their digital transformation over the last 12 months. That was kind of a temporary move, and I think now we're making this a little bit more permanent. So I've gone back too much there. Really what I'm going to cover a little bit later as well is pretty much increasing the focus on documentation, probably less paper, but more documentation. And I'm going to give you also some tips as to the equipment that you might be helpful to help you with this next 12 months or so. I will give a copy of the slides, but feel free to screen grab if you want to. That's also fine. Really, it has to start with the top. And last year, as leaders, we all had to sort of make some temporary arrangements, as I said. So now 2021, it is the time for leaders to buy in. And if we do want to remote work well, we need to have that from the top down and everybody doing that. So there's a lovely quote there: start by cutting off the head. That is not the Queen of Hearts. That is what Julian Dolan said about starting with cutting off the top. And everyone then will become much better at being remote. And the hybrid is a really difficult thing to do, and actually what you really need to think of is that everyone has the ability to be remote, and I'll show you some digital whiteboards that can replace your manual whiteboards as well during the presentation this morning. This next slide is a lovely one that I've had from a course I did in January, February this year, and I'm not going to read that through, but this is really, really important for the leaders here to understand that we are going to have to take our team through a process. Anything when you're transforming or change is really quite difficult. So that's a wonderful slide that I wanted to share with you to show you that we really have to pull out all of the toolkits, all of the tools in the toolkit to help our teams work really well remotely. And one more for you to screen grab is this one, which was a wonderful lady that due to Zoom and all the things that we've been listening to over the last 12 months, that's how I got that. That's a screen grab from Laurie Bell, who spoke last year. I was really, really motivated by her, so much so that I printed that off, and that actually is on the other side of my laptop. I have it blue tacked to my laptop's lid just to remind me that communicate is really important. Be a role model, think strategically, all of those things, and we do have to be quite agile, and we are having to move so much at pace. So there's lots of bullet points there that I've really enjoyed from Laurie, so I wanted to share those with you, which are not particularly about digital. It's just about everything and about where we are. Okay, so what we're really heading for by the end of this 20 minutes, this is one key phrase which I'd like you all to take away, is a single source of truth. So I'm going to give you some tips as some tools that you can do to create this single source of truth. What we have to create in the workplace now from home is a live, real, trusted single source of truth, and give our home workers the opportunity to share where they're doing, the iterations of their work, and really importantly is to provide transparency for what people are doing at home. And Sally touched on that with the things there about wanting to pop out to do some personal things. That's all fine, but we need to know that. We need to be very transparent and really, really increase our communication with our teams. One of the ways is Microsoft. That wheel there shows you all of the Office 365 products that are available. Okay, and if you do have an Office 365 license, those are all free or part of your license. We've worked with Olivia's part of the Livers team, Worcestershire Business Central and Worcestershire County Council this year, helping over 80 companies to show them some of the tools that are available as part of the Office 365 suite. So if you're only using Office 365 for your Outlook, then there is all this other plethora of wonderful tools that are at your disposal to use. So please have a look into that, and there'll be people here, your normal IT providers here, who will help you further with that as well. So ask, because all of those things are there for you already, and just there. It's a bit like your washing machine. You only use a couple of the settings. The same with Microsoft Office 365. You might only use 2 or 3 of them when there's actually so many more there that you can be using. The next slide shows Borwell's. These are our favourite apps. These are the ones that we're using at the moment that we could not live without. So 2 of those are from the Office 365 suite, the Teams and SharePoint. So Microsoft Teams, we do use Zoom. I'm using Zoom now, of course we all are, but Microsoft Teams is not just another Zoom. There is so much more that goes on behind that, and it's brilliant for internal. Sally mentioned about sending an email to the wrong person. If you suddenly start typing Andrea or Steve, there could be lots and lots of Steves. We use Teams for all of our internal communications. We do not email internally to our team. So that's one way of cutting down some mistakes. So that's one thing. We do not use email for that. We only keep that within Teams. And there's lots more besides as well. So there are planners there. You can share documents, all within Teams and SharePoint. So the 2 used carefully together are absolutely imperative to us as internally, and it does cut down a lot of those opportunities for mistakes. Miro is the whiteboard I mentioned earlier. So that's a digital whiteboard. You pay a subscription for that. There are free ones available, but I always say when it's free, you are you are paying for that, you are the product. So there's questions over security if you're using free stuff. They've got access to your stuff, a bit like social media, really. So that's a whole conversation. I could talk to you for 20 minutes on that. But Miro is one to look out for. That's a brilliant whiteboard tool. And you can save all those there and do lots of collaboration with your remote teams working from home. It works really well. You can use Post-it notes, you can use dot voting, all sorts of things. Really, really useful. Of course, a CRM system is really important. And Borwell's CRM of choice is called Really Simple Systems. So recommend that one for you. And again, for that single source of truth, where are you with a client? Who's spoken to who? You miss, when you're working from home, you miss those conversations across the office, don't you? You just don't hear that someone's talking to someone. So this is really important that you keep that single source of truth. You phone someone, you don't want to nag them, you don't want to phone them too often, you don't want to miss an opportunity. So having a good CRM system, and there are loads out there, making sure that that's used correctly and everyone knows the rules of how you want things recorded. So that's really, really important. Harvest and Forecast, the orange logos there, those are from the same company. So Harvest is for timesheets, and that's recording. It has a little clock on it, so it's great for lawyers. So you can actually just set the clock running and know when you're on a project, but you don't have to use it that way. You can do it retrospectively and just say, well, I worked on this for 30 minutes or 40 minutes. So that's a way of managing your time. Another opportunity to show that you're being transparent. So that's a good one that we use. Forecast is, they actually link together, but that's really planning what you're going to do over the next few weeks, months, days. So you can look at that and plan where the workload is. So those are some of our favorite apps that I would recommend you have a look at. Right, meetings. This is a good one. Again, I could probably do a whole 20 minutes on meetings. What we have done at Borwell is several things, really. We've reduced meeting time, so any internal meeting is now a maximum of 45 minutes. So we've done that. It has to have an agenda. It's always recorded and transcribed, which is quite hilarious. So we do all of those. Anyone that's a decision maker is invited to that meeting. Anyone who isn't can be put as optional, and then people can make their choice rather than having meetings for meeting's sake. And then what's really wonderful about recording everything is you can just say, oh, it's a shame you weren't in that meeting. We discussed this, have a listen from 12 minutes onwards. And then you can let somebody know that they can just listen to the little bit that perhaps was useful for them. So that's what we've been trying to do. Yeah, I think that's on the meetings thing. Oh, and the other thing, I might come on to this a little bit again later, is that we have open meetings as well, where people can just come in and have a cup of tea, come in and have a chat. So we do those twice a day, and they're completely informal, and gives people an open channel just to come and chat about those. But anything else, I think that's yeah, that's all right on that one. Security, absolutely huge. Sally's mentioned a lot of things there that we need to consider. There's a list of things you need to consider. Again, screen grab that or wait for the slides to come out and go through. I'm not going to go through them one by one. However, there's all sorts of things, talking about using your own laptop, shutting down at the end of the working day. That does do your updates as well. So that's really useful rather than just shutting it down, close it down properly. There's one. Using a VPN, using two-factor authentication. If all of these things don't mean anything to you, then Cyber Essentials is one way of asking the right questions of your IT provider or the person that's your data controller. So it's a good way to go through that. And that gives you a tick to say that you have been, and it also encourages you to use to some staff training. So if you can't answer those bullet points, then you probably need to have a look at bringing in those documents and looking at Cyber Essentials as a way to bring those policies around and improve them. Your LastPass is brilliant for your password security, and that uses two-factor authentication, and it also prompts you to change your passwords regularly, and it makes your passwords longer. So that's a great one, another one I'll recommend. And having a VPN. I'm on one now. You won't know any difference, but actually it makes it a lot safer for everyone and for your data. So however big your company is, if you've got company data, you should be investing in a VPN. I'm afraid that it has been an opportunity for fraud, and these are the latest stats that I had available up until since March 2020 for the whole year of COVID. So I'm afraid those are very real. That's from the BBC, and you really do need to start having a think about digital fraud and taking that even more seriously. As always, why people can't use their technology for good use, I don't know, but it's been a great time while people have been at home and a little bit more relaxed about things, to people to find that as an opportunity, which is really, really sad, I have to say. Okay. Health and safety, how are we doing for time? Yeah, health and safety. So we talked about stress and isolation, and also about setting up that workspace. So posture is really, really important. I'm blessed here with 2 monitors up here and a laptop down here. You should not be working on a laptop, just and I've got a separate keyboard as well. Yeah, there we are. So separate keyboard and mouse. And we had photographs taken, all of our team. We didn't use the right to enter, but we did ask them for their photographs of their workspace. And they either took items from the science park where we're normally based, or we bought new equipment and made sure that everyone had a setup like this or like this, with natural light, making sure they've got all those items in place. As Sally said, we are still legally obliged to look after your employees while they're working from home. And I am shocked beyond belief when I still see people working just on a laptop without a separate keyboard and without an adjustable height monitor and a good chair. So you shouldn't be working on a kitchen chair. You should either invest yourself or ask your employer to invest in a really good chair. I haven't quite gone as far as doing a separate risk assessment for each person, but I think the photograph could be put into that, and I think I should perhaps make it a little bit even more formal, but we've kept all of those and making sure that everyone has had what they needed to. Not everyone has dedicated space, so again, that's where your security comes back in. Really, really important to do that. Okay, so I have rattled through these because we were absolutely worried about time today with the 2 of us. If I just go through, this is a lovely little picture which I quite like about that, and I'll go back through it again. So experiment with your work setup. Okay, number 1, that's the HSE requirements. Have a little look at those. 2, creating work and home boundaries. Really, really important to make sure that blurred lines don't happen. So harvest is a way of having that time and that boundaries, using forecast to know where they are and to stop. Right, that's really important, just to make sure that you are switching off. Fly in the screen, can you see that? Number 3, preparing for meetings. Every meeting has to have an agenda as well. I think I missed that out when I spoke to you earlier. So have an agenda for each meeting so that you can prepare before they come, and it saves that meeting time. So as well as reducing them to 45 minutes and everything else, each meeting should be agendaed. Creating accountability for yourself. Use Outlook and Planner, which is part of the Office 365, to show when you're available and when you're not. Number 5, be visible at work. On Teams, there is settings that show you whether you're be right back, available, do not disturb. Use that to let people know either what you're working on or that you're not available, so that people know not to disturb you. When you're in the office, you would see that someone is sort of head down and really sort of getting into a project or something, or getting into flow. So use that to help yourself and to let others help you, not to keep disturbing you. That's a really good one to do. Communicate clearly and effectively. That's that single source of truth. Don't assume people know what you're doing. Don't assume that people know that you've spoken to someone. We have to increase the communication, have to increase digital documentation, and use that low context. So explain, go back a little bit in the steps so that people haven't missed a step of what you're trying to describe. That is the hardest thing, especially when I'm working with software engineers. The communication, they know what their head down in the flow, but don't always tell people what's going on. So that's where we're really working hard on that at the moment. And 7, health and well-being, working on your health. What we've done at Borwell, we've set up, as part of Teams, we've got some health and well-being channels. So we've got lots of, I call them SOCs, like societies. So we've got lots of separate teams that people can join and drop in and out. So we've got one on photography, we've got one on gaming, we've got one on films, so that you can drop into those channels and share your own interests with your peers. I think less and less people are looking to work as their social life, but actually some people do still need that. Not everyone, but there are people who are at risk of being lonely, who are living on their own and have been for a long time. So if we can try and provide different ways to interact, maybe different ways to start a conversation, not just an open channel where you talk about anything. It could be about pets, could be anything. Start that with so people with similar interests have got something to start talking about. So those are really nice. You can just drop in, you can just drop things in there, or links to things that are perhaps more interesting. Set up gaming nights if you're into a particular game. So that's number 7. 8, clear responsibilities. I think for that one, I'm going to say it's everyone's responsibility to be GDPR compliant. And it's really important to have that training and cybersecurity. It's everyone's responsibility. So set them out for your team. Make sure that everyone understands what their responsibility is with that. Tea breaks, talk with the team. We do them at 10 o'clock and 3 o'clock. So it's 15-minute tea breaks. Anyone can drop in whenever they want to. So they're calendared. It's just an open channel on Teams. You could use Zoom, could use whatever you wanted to do, or Hangouts or something, but just calendar them. They're in there and people can just drop in and talk about anything, but probably not work. And 10, take time to socialise. At the end of the day, switch off and a proper shutdown. Okay, that gives time for updates and everything else, but also gives you time to go and have a walk around the block, walk the dog, get away from the screen, because I think we're right. I think we are having a little bit too much time at screens. So that's a little bit of a overview of everything that I probably have missed a few bits, but there we are. I think I'll go with that. And I've got some useful links that I can share with you there to some of the parts that where I've had some of that information from. I just want to say thank you. Thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrea, and thank you again to Sally. I'm going to rush straight into questions because we've only got 5 minutes left and I do want to make sure we can answer as many as possible. Has anyone got any questions? If you have, just come off mute and I'll try and...
Hi Liv, I have.
Yeah, go for it.
Hi everyone, Tanya from the Chamber. I've got a couple of questions actually, so thanks Sally and Andrea. I found that really informative, and like you, I could probably sit here for much longer going through all the different elements. I've got 2 questions, one probably more directed to Sally, and a quick question for Andrea, if that's okay. So Sally, in terms of the coming back into a normal working routine for staff, particularly staff with young children, where pre-pandemic we would have a normal routine of working in the office, working office hours, children would be in childcare. During pandemic, some people are obviously have their children at home with them whilst they're trying to work, so you sort of try to support with flexible working arrangements where they might catch up on work in the evenings and things like that, just to make up some of the time. Is there any stance on that moving forward for trying to get back into a more regular routine and having people available when you need them versus them still wishing to keep their children at home? You're on mute, Sally.
There we go. Absolutely. And that's why I thought this was such a topical thing to talk about now, because I think Now, remember, the children being at home was supposed to be a temporary issue whilst, for example, the schools were closed or nurseries were closed or whatever the case would be. It wasn't that, okay, that happened and now actually all of your employees should have their kids at home and they shouldn't be going into nursery or whatever the case may be. Okay, so it should be that you're thinking now about how everybody reverts back to it being normal. Kids go into nursery and they either come into work or they'll be at home working. But I don't think there's an assumption that just because they're home working, they're also childcare responsible whilst they're at home. It should be that those nurseries should kick back in and people should be going back. However, my view is which is why, again, this is topical, is that now you'll probably start to receive the flexible working applications from people saying, actually, I want to work at home and I want to have childcare at home, which is not part of their normal contract, obviously. So if they want to propose that, they've got to do that as a formal flexible working application. Okay. Does that help?
Yeah, very much so. Thank you.
Other than that, really, people should be starting to revert. If it's going to be you're coming back into the office or you're working from home, it should be that they're working from home without those childcare responsibilities.
Thank you. And my other quick question to Andrea was about the Microsoft package and the licenses. So if we've got a license for Office 365, you sort of showed that wheel and it had, for example, Dynamics 365 on the wheel. So am I right in thinking then, because we've got an Office 365 license, I can get Dynamics 365 within that license? I don't have to pay an additional license fee?
I believe not.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks all. Any other questions? If you want to take yourselves off mute. Anyone else? Final chance. Okay, if anyone does think of any questions, if there's anything you want me to pass on to Sally or to Andrea after the webinar, then please let me know. We've literally got a minute left. So the only thing I wanted to say is a huge thank you to Sally and to Andrea for their time and their expertise this afternoon. I know a lot of you will have really appreciated it and we're getting lots of comments of thanks in the chat. Another webinar I thought this group might be interested in is on the 22nd of June, midday, and it's all around mental health in the workplace. So we've got a bit of legal, a bit of digital, but then also a little bit around the mental health of all of our employees as well. If you want to come on that, again, completely free of charge, then please let me know. Thank you all so much for attending. I hope you get a chance to enjoy the sunshine this afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you.